Greetings! Before we begin this week's episode of Hot Cocoa, I'd like to offer a bit of a disclaimer. That being that 1, I don't own an iPhone, 2, I don't own an iPod Touch, and 3, I am not in the iPhone developer program because that costs $99 and I think that's exorbitantly expensive. That being said, I really have no idea whether or not this code will run on an actual iPhone because I don't have one to test it on. However, it does run in the simulator, and theoretically, if it runs on the simulator, it should run on the real thing. So, that over with. On this week's episode of Hot Cocoa, we will introduce you to some of the concepts behind iPhone programming, and some of the differences between iPhone programming and programming for OS X. And we'll write a simple little sample application to illustrate some of those differences. Coming up on Hot Cocoa, Episode 6, Intro to iPhone Programming. So to begin our adventures into iPhone programming, the first thing you're going to need to do is make sure that you have at least Xcode 3.1, because that's the one in which they added support for programming it in, which, there we go. Xcode 3.1 is what you want. And also, in addition to Xcode 3.1, you'll need the iPhone SDK, which you can get by going to developer.apple.com and clicking on the iPhone developer program. And here you have two options. You can either apply to the developer program, which costs $99 for an individual, or $299 if you're an enterprise, which I think $99 for an individual is a bit expensive, which is why I don't have one. But luckily, if you just want to play around with it, you can download the free iPhone SDK, which it'll let you program for it, and it'll let you run it on the simulator. However, I don't believe it'll let you run it on the actual device, and I know it won't let you release it in the iPhone App Store. So if you go to the free iPhone SDK and go to download now, you'll need to log in with your Apple ID, or if you don't have one, you can create one. And if you already have like an iTunes Store account, that's your Apple ID. You don't need an additional developer Apple ID. So if I log in there, you'll be brought to this page. There we go. And right there, it's where you can download the SDK. And just a forewarning, I believe last time I downloaded the SDK was about a 1.1 gigabyte download. So just be forewarned, it's a really big download. So now that we have that download set up and installed, once we go to in Xcode, go to File and New Project, we can go to an application under iPhone OS. And here you have a couple different options for what kind of application you wish to create. The first one we have here is a navigation-based application, which is where basically you have a navigation bar at the top, and then you have sort of the iPhone's equivalent to a list view, or what it calls a table view, below it. And you can click on elements and go to sort of like a tree view. If you click on an element, it'll load the elements underneath of that, and then you can navigate through that, and that's a navigation-based application. Then you have the OpenGL ES application, which is it gives you a view that runs OpenGL, which will let you program games and stuff like that. A tab bar application, which has a view with a tab bar at the bottom that lets you tab between different views that you want to have. And then a utility application, which sets up an application that has two views, and down in the corner of one of the views there's a little button with an eye on it, where typically what would happen is you'd click on that eye and the panel would flip over and animate, and it would show you the settings, then you hit done and it would flip back. And that's what a utility application is. And then you have the two more generic options, which is a view-based application, which just is a blank view inside of a window. And then you have a window-based application, which just has, as it says, an application delegate and a window. Now, some of the terms they're similar, but they're slightly different from how you code on OS X. On OS X, generally you would put the interface elements directly on a window. On the iPhone, you generally put them on a view, because that you can only have one window per application, I think, on an iPhone. I'm not positive about that, but I'm pretty sure you can only have one window per application. And if you want to have more than one thing on the screen, then you're going to need to have multiple views, and you can switch between them. So for our first really simple application, just to illustrate some of the concepts, we're going to make a view-based application. And we will name this, let's see, iPhone Sum. We'll save that. And here is our first iPhone project. So I'll go ahead and introduce you to some of the new files that we have here. You'll notice that some of the ones are still the same. We still have Foundation Framework, and we still have main.im, and we have a main window.zib. But then we also have a few other ones. We have the UIKit framework, which is UIKit is basically Cocoa Touch. It's the iPhone's version of Cocoa. We have a view controller, which will function as our app controller and will control any of the interface elements we have on that particular view that it created for us. And then the app delegate, which basically controls the views themselves. So you have the app delegate, which is sort of like a subset of the window, which controls the view themselves, and then a view controller, which controls the elements on the view. So let's start our oh so awesome interface by going into mainmenu.zib. Now, you'll see here that this is actually just a window, and there's a view inside this window. But the reason I came here first is because I wanted to show you something else. If you go into the window, this is where you can control. If you click this button here, that's how you control how it rotates, and you can see it'll rotate for you, and there's that. But we won't be going into how to make rotating programs just yet. However, where we want to go, is into the view controller.zib, and that's where we will put our interface. If we go back into our trusty library, you can see some of the options we have here for programming with the iPhone. You'll notice the objects are now yellowish orange instead of a blue, like they would be on a regular OS X Cocoa program. These are all your controllers up here. You have a regular object, you have a proxy object, and then here are the interface elements you can use. You have a table view, which if you drag out, you'll see it'll generally expand to fill the whole window. And put that back in there. A table view cell, which is an individual element of the table view. You have the image view, a web view, which is basically the same as the web view, and an image view on OS X. Text view, same as the text view on OS X. You'll see how they automatically resize. Picker view, which is the equivalent of a list view or a combo box or button, just more oriented for a scrolling environment, a touch environment. Delete that. And we have a date view, which is picking dates, or date picker rather. A segmented control, which lets you pick between different options. Labels. I keep dragging it back there. I don't want to do that. We have labels, and here are buttons, which we'll be using in a moment. A text field, switch, slide, progress. Those are all familiar. Activity indicator also pretty familiar. A page control, which if you drag it onto here lets you flip between pages. Like if you have more than however many applications fits on one page, you can like flip between them. And then you have Windows views and things that go on the top and the bottom of the screen. For example, like you can put a search bar up here. You could put a navigation bar up here. You can put other stuff in the navigation bar, like navigation item. You can put toolbars down here, or you can put up here if you really wanted. And you can put buttons for the toolbars here, and tab bar, which, like, there you go, that would go like that. Then an item to put on the tab bar. So what we're going to need for our sum application is 3 text fields. So we put one there, and one over here, and then one in the middle, like so, and then a button. And you'll notice that you can actually resize these buttons vertically as well as horizontally, which I'm going to do, but I think it may change that back once I change the text. Let me try this. So, there we go. So, one of the things you need to consider when programming for the iPhone is the fact that people are going to be using their fingers to navigate around the interface, which is generally bigger than a mouse cursor. So, you want to make sure things are not, like, really close together on the interface, because that may make it hard to select which one you want. Kind of like the buttons on the keyboard on the screen may be too close together. It may get a little, like, hard to pick them. So we have our interface set up here, and we will save this, and we can close the library. Now, you'll notice I said earlier that the view controller back here will act as our app controller on a regular Cocoa application. And that is because in order to control this, we need to talk to the file owner. And the file owner, if we go here, you'll notice is the view controller. And that will control all of this stuff for us. Instead of creating our own object and making that a app controller class, we'll be using the file owner. So we'll close this and get to programming some code. So here in the iPhone sum view controller.h, our header file, this is basically the same as just programming it in Cocoa, except for one little difference, which I need to go back here to point out. If you click on the elements, you'll notice that these are UI text fields and not NS text fields. So when we're writing our headers, we need to make sure that we're classifying them as a UI text field and not a NS text field, otherwise it won't work. So we'll make an IB outlet for each of those, and we want to make sure they're UI text fields, and we'll call them num1 field. And then I'll go ahead and copy and paste that code for the other two. And we'll make it num2 field and sum field. And then we also want to make an action for the button. So we have our IB action, and we'll call this calc sum. And same as in Cocoa, we end it with ID or id sender. So we'll go ahead and save that header file, and then switch back to Interface Builder, and now we can link them. And linking pretty much works just like it does in Cocoa. For OS X, you hold down the Control key, and then drag from the file owner, in this case, to the text fields. So we'll name that one num1 field, num2 field, and sum field. And then for the actions, we'll drag from the button to the file owner. Oops, make sure it selects the button. There we go. And we'll set that to calc sum. And we are done with the interface for now. So let's start programming what this does. If we'll select that, and I'm going to just copy and paste it without the semicolon into here, into the im, the iPhone sum view controller.im, you'll notice if I move this up, there's a lot of code that's already written for us, which is this right here should auto-rotate to interface orientation, controls whether or not that view will automatically rotate around if you rotate the iPhone, and that will return a Boolean value saying whether or not we've programmed that, which in this case we haven't. And then did receive memory warning, which will release it if it doesn't have super view, which in this case is the window, and cleans up the memory, and then we have deallocate, which deallocates it. So we will just get rid of those comments there, just make it a little bit cleaner, and paste our code in there. And the first thing we need to do is declare the variables that we're going to use to hold our values that we're going to get and set to the text fields, because there's a bit of a difference in how we need to handle that on the iPhone. So we want to set num1 to, this is num1 field text, and you'll notice that instead of having string value or int value here, which is what you'd use on Cocoa for OS X, we have text because we want it to return that's the only return it has. And in fact, if you look in the documentation for it, if we go to UI text field, there we go, scroll down, you'll see that it lists text here, and that's the only way you can get it. It doesn't have the int value for returning it or the string value for returning it. All we get is text, which is why we need to have those separate values, which I'll show you in just a second. Another thing to point out here is that since the iPhone was based on Objective-C 2.0, all of these are listed as properties, which is basically another simplified way for setting properties that sort of automates the what you call that, the way that you use getters and setters normally. However, since you could do a whole show just on the new stuff in Objective-C 2.0, we're just going to treat them exactly as if they were methods. They will still work in the old way if you program them that way, and we'll get to showing you how to use properties in a later episode. So since we can only get an in-a-string object out of the field, we then need to take that in-a-string object, which is why I have 2 brackets here, and get the int value of that in-a-string object. And then we need to do the same thing for num2. Field text int value. There we go. And then just add them together. Num1 plus num2 equals sum. And then in order to set them back, we will use the setText method, like so, for some field, set text, and you'll notice the auto completion here will say that it would like in a string value, please. So we'll in a string, we'll use the class method, and you'll know it's a class method like we talked about in episode 2, because I'm calling that method to the initString class and not to an instance of that class. And we're going to use its string with format method. And we will use the %i, which will let us stick an integer into that string there, and the integer we want to stick in there is thumb, like so. And close our bracket there, and cross our fingers and hope this works. So we'll build and go, save all, and it will compile it. There it is, and there's our application. And we can click on here, and you can use your regular keyboard to enter numbers, like so, and there's the sum. However, you notice there's a bit of an interface issue here. When we click on it, it brings up a keyboard. And we don't want it to bring up a keyboard because We don't want people typing letters into there. Now, of course, you could click that button there and enter numbers like that, but it would be better if we just made the user have to enter numbers, because if you enter letters in there, we're expecting a number and the program could freak out. So we'll close our application there, go back into the interface, and wait for it to load. There we go. And if we click on the text boxes and then go into their attributes, you'll see that, let me move this a little closer here. We have the keyboard settings for what happens when you click on it. And we want to change the keyboard type from default to a number pad, and that way they can only enter numbers. I'll do the same for the other one, number pad. And because we don't want them to type at all on this one, because that's just our return, you'll just turn off enabled. If we save that, build and go. If we click on it, we now have only a number pad, so they can only type in numbers. And there's our sum. Now the iPhone simulator that we have here is useful, especially if you're not a part of the $99 developer program, because it lets you test your applications without having to send them to an actual iPhone. And you'll notice that it also has the other programs that you've made in here, as well as settings that you can mess around with, just like on the iPhone. And it has photos on here, it has contacts on here, and it even has Safari on here, which is actually a good way to check out how a website will look on the iPhone if you're developing a website for the iPhone. So, for example, if we go to hotcocoa.com, oopsies, like there's Hot Cocoa. Ta-da! And also, if you hold down the Option key, you'll notice you get these two little circles here. And that lets you perform the two-finger gesture, gestures like this, zooming here and zooming out, like so. And all the touch stuff works just like on a real iPhone. So like here, and load our forms, our new forms, by the way, so you can check them out and just browse around them and test stuff. That concludes our intro to iPhone programming. See you next week on Hot Cocoa.